Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the shimmering sands of an ancient world, one where bronze clinks with every footstep, sunburn is the norm, and beards, well, they're about to become a problem. Picture it, an endless desert stretched before you, Alexander the Great's army marching under a cruel white-hot sky. Your boots crunch over cracked stone, your throat's drier than a philosophy lecture. And just when you think it can't get any worse, someone mentions you're expected to shave. Yes! Shave. Out here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling bold, drop a comment with your location and the time where you are. I love seeing where my sleepy little army is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward through Persia's desert with a sun-baked helmet pressing into your temples and your shield growing heavier by the minute. Every man around you is moving the same way, slow, steady, driven not by comfort, but by conquest. Your tunic clings to your skin, soaked through with sweat and streaked with dust. The sun doesn't just warm you, it cooks you. It's hard to tell what's worse, the blistering heat above or the shifting grit beneath your sandals. And there, in the center of it all, rides Alexander. He's young, sharp-eyed, and, crucially, clean-shaven. Now, that might seem like a random detail, but remember it. It's about to matter more than you think. At this moment in history, around 331 BCE, you and tens of thousands of others are marching toward Gaugamela, where Alexander will face the vast armies of Darius III. Tensions are high, supplies are low, and morale? Well, it depends on whether your boots still have soles. What's incredible is that even as Alexander's soldiers fought dehydration, sandstorms, and homesickness, their leader was obsessing over the little things. He had a habit of zeroing in on details others dismissed. How a man stood, how he carried his spear, even how he tied his sandals. To Alexander, everything could be weaponized, even your grooming routine. Which is why as you reach a small rocky encampment just shy of the Euphrates, a buzz starts up in camp. Not of flies, but of barbers. Word spreads fast. Alexander has ordered all soldiers to shave off their beards. The first reaction? Disbelief. You're in the middle of nowhere. Your skin's already flaking off like papyrus, and now you're supposed to drag a blade across your face? But the command is clear, and it's not optional. One grizzled veteran mutters, "What's next, pedicures?" Another huffs and says, "Maybe he wants us to dazzle the Persians with our baby faces." The mood is equal parts ridicule and resignation, because Alexander might be worshipped like a god, but he's also your boss, and a terrifyingly effective one. When he gives an order, the smart ones obey. And let's be honest, shaving wasn't just a hardship, it was logistically weird. Out here, there are no bronze-framed mirrors or perfumed soaps. Soldiers reach for the dull edges of daggers, borrowed knives, or even shards of polished metal to see their own faces. It's like trying to perform brain surgery with a spoon. Still, the men obey. Slowly, the camps begin to change. Beards vanish like dew at dawn. One tent at a time, the army begins to gleam just a little more. The desert doesn't care. The sun beats down just as cruelly, and the wind still whips sand into your eyes. But now, there's a strange new sensation. Your freshly shaved face stings every time a breeze rolls through. And beneath the discomfort, there's something else too. A shared sense of transformation. See, Alexander didn't just order shaving for laughs or appearances. Not even close. He was preparing his men for a kind of combat they'd only ever imagined. Close combat, where inches made the difference between life and death. A Persian warrior could seize a handful of beard and use it to drag you down, disorient you, or slice across your unprotected throat. There are records, some more exaggerated than others, of warriors literally using enemy beards to control their heads like handles. Not exactly a flattering battlefield moment, but more on that later. For now, you just focus on how strange your face feels without the familiar weight of your beard. Your jaw feels exposed, naked. Kind of like when you text someone a risky message and they leave you on read. And yet, in the silence of the desert night, under a blanket of stars and the faint hiss of sand shifting across stone, something strange starts to happen. You catch glimpses of your fellow soldiers, also newly shaved, looking oddly united. Different men from different cities now resemble a single force, identical in face, uniform, and now chin. There's a kind of symbolic power in it, almost religious, like shedding hair was shedding the individual and becoming part of something larger, something unstoppable. Historians still argue whether Alexander truly made the beard rule official at this exact point in the campaign, or whether it was more of a cultural shift he encouraged. The sources are murky. Ancient historians like Plutarch loved a good story, and modern scholars aren't sure how much was fact, how much was flair. But one thing is clear. In this particular patch of blazing, sand-swept wilderness, thousands of men reached for their blades, not to fight, but to shave. And for Alexander, that decision was just one more stroke on the grand canvas of conquest. Because where others saw desert, he saw opportunity. And where others saw beards, he saw vulnerability. The order spreads like wildfire. Shave your beard. That's it. No explanation offered. No pamphlets handed out. No inspirational speech about unity or tactics. Just a lean, direct command that slaps the dust right off your assumptions. At first, you think it's a joke. Someone misheard a Macedonian idiom, maybe, or a punishment for one poor soul who tried to smuggle wine. But as officers pass down the line with their usual mix of boredom and menace, the message remains stubbornly consistent. Clean faces, everyone. Now, in the chaotic world of Alexander's army, a strange sort of hierarchy exists. Veteran hoplites give advice no one asked for. Young recruits try not to pass out from heat stroke. And somewhere in between are the camp barbers, a previously underappreciated group now enjoying rock star status. Their kits, usually tucked away behind bags of olives and dented helmets, are suddenly in high demand. Blades are cleaned. Water is boiled. Soap, when it exists, is divided like treasure. The soldiers don't exactly queue in orderly lines. This is an army, not a spa. There are arguments, bribes, and a few fistfights. One man tries to shave with his spearhead. Another asks if he can just braid the beard instead. You lean over a chipped bronze basin, peer into a warped reflection, and drag a blade across your jaw with the same concentration usually reserved for dodging arrows. One wrong slip, and you'll be explaining to your commander why your chin looks like it was attacked by a particularly angry squirrel. And here's the kicker. Alexander has already shaved. Of course he has. He always does everything first. First into battle, first to eat last, first to sleep on the ground, first to bleed. Now, first to remove the beard. He walks the camp with that intense, quiet stare of his, checking chins like a general inspecting spears. If he notices someone disobeying the order, he doesn't yell. He doesn't need to. A raised eyebrow from Alexander could drop morale faster than a Persian cavalry charge. But why now? Why here, in this unforgiving stretch of sand, with Darius's army looming on the other side of the world's most uncomfortable waiting room? Well, some say it was about discipline. Beards were symbols of pride, of independence, of old habits. And Alexander? He was sculpting something new. His army wasn't just a mob of hired swords. It was a machine. And machines don't have beards. Others whisper that it was psychological. Shaving in this context wasn't comfort. It was commitment. Every scrape of the blade was a gesture of loyalty, an acceptance that your body wasn't entirely yours anymore. You were part of something greater, shinier, and slightly more aerodynamic. Still others suggest the reason was entirely practical, because in battle, especially the kind Alexander favored, intimate, chaotic, up close, the beard could be a liability. Persian soldiers reportedly trained in grappling. Imagine being pulled down by your facial hair in the middle of a duel. Not exactly heroic, more like humiliating. Of course, historians can't agree on any of this. Surprise, surprise. Some believe the beard story was exaggerated, a bit of flair added centuries later to highlight Alexander's obsessive attention to detail. Others claim it actually originated earlier in Greek military tradition, and that Alexander merely adopted it to distinguish his soldiers from the Persians, who, by contrast, often wore magnificent beards like status symbols. There's even a fringe theory, half serious, half silly, that Alexander hated facial hair because his grew in patchy. Not exactly the face of a god king. But hey, no one wants to look like the only guy who failed Movember. What we do know is that the beard order worked. The soldiers grumbled. They mocked, they sulked, but they complied. And something changed. With every face bared to the sun, the army began to feel less like a collection of city-states and more like a singular force, less Athens versus Sparta versus Thebes, more Macedon united. You start to notice things. A lean infantryman from Argos nods at a cavalryman from Thessaly like they've been training together for years. That old guy with the beard that used to nest sparrows? Now you realize he's got a jaw like a marble sculpture and a weirdly endearing cleft chin. And Alexander, he seems oddly pleased, not smug, just satisfied, like a painter who's finally decided on a color palette. He speaks rarely but clearly. His officers repeat the message. This isn't about vanity. This is about survival, about agility, about not giving your enemy anything to grab onto, literally or metaphorically. And perhaps most interesting of all, the Persians take notice. Scouts return with strange reports. Darius's spies are confused. They'd expected a dusty mob of Greek hoplites. Instead, they see an army glinting in the sun like a row of bronze teeth. A force that looks unified, prepared, shaved. The change ripples out beyond appearance. Morale lifts. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough to make men march an extra mile without complaint. Enough to make them believe that if their king asks them to remove even a part of themselves, it must be for a reason. Some men even start enjoying it. You spot one fellow rubbing oil on his cheeks like he's auditioning for a spot in an Athenian drama. Another crafts a joke. Alexander took our beards so we'd all fit in his statue. And yet, underneath the humor is something else. Respect. He might be demanding. He might be weirdly obsessed with horses, stars, and Homeric poetry. But Alexander understands the battlefield like no one else. And if he says a beard could cost you your life, well, maybe he's right. At night, the camp flickers with small fires. The buzz of preparation fills the air, sharpening blades, whispering tactics, praying to gods old and new. And somewhere in the background, the faint sound of scraping metal on skin continues, because the beard order has been given. And tomorrow, when the sun rises over a desert, soon to be soaked in sweat and blood, you'll face the enemy with nothing to hide behind. Not even your own face. Morning in the desert doesn't so much arrive as it ambushes you. One moment you're curled beneath a threadbare cloak trying to forget the stiffness in your spine, and the next, a searing wall of heat presses down on your face like an angry god with a hairdryer. You blink into the rising sun, now beardless, sore, and vaguely concerned that your jaw is more sunburn-prone than previously estimated. Across the camp, other men stir. And for the first time, many of them are seeing one another without their beards, some after years, even decades. It's not quite the army of Adonises Alexander might have hoped for. There are patchy chins, unexpected scars, and at least one man who has discovered he has a second chin and is furious about it. Still, there's something striking about the change. The morning light catches on jawlines like it used to on shields. Bronze helms slide over smooth cheeks. And there's a peculiar quiet in the camp, not somber, not tense. More like the silence you get when everyone realizes they're all part of something bigger than just another battle. Something curated. If you're imagining these men primping in bronze mirrors and comparing exfoliation routines, slow down. This is still an army. Tough, blistered, dust-covered. But the beardless look has transformed more than just appearances. It's reshaped the way the soldiers carry themselves. Shaving has become ritual. Not just a task, but a practice. Some men do it daily now, carefully scraping their cheeks with the obsessive precision of a priest arranging temple offerings. Others have formed little informal grooming circles, sharing water, blades, and occasionally jokes about who has the least heroic chin. And this is where things get really fascinating. Alexander has essentially weaponized vanity. To understand the genius of that, you need to consider the cultural backdrop. Greek society didn't see grooming as weakness. Quite the opposite. A polished appearance reflected discipline, control, and even moral virtue. The ideal man was clean, composed, and physically beautiful, not in a vain, peacocky way, but in that my body is a reflection of my soul way philosophers love to drone on about. So when Alexander issued the beard command, he wasn't just making a practical move. He was tapping into a cultural nerve. He reframed shaving as a military virtue. If you were smooth-faced, you weren't vain. You were sharp, battle-ready, tactical, sophisticated, and the men bought it. Some even leaned into it. A few soldiers start giving themselves little cuts on purpose, faint nicks on the cheek, to show off how close a shave they can handle. Others swap stories of grooming disasters like old war wounds. One guy claims he cut his ear clean off mid-shave. No one believes him, but the story spreads anyway. In truth, the act of shaving becomes a way to process anxiety. A morning ritual, however ridiculous, brings structure in a world where you might die before lunch. You can't control the sandstorms. You can't control Darius, or the odds, or the gods. But you can control how clean your face is when you meet fate. And let's not ignore the funnier side of it. There are entire genres of insults now available to you and your comrades. Nice jaw. I didn't realize you borrowed it from a fish. Your beard was the only thing hiding your resemblance to a startled goat. You look like a child pretending to be a soldier. Even the officers get in on it. One commander declares shaving an act of aerodynamic combat preparedness. Another jokes that they're now a faster army because there's less wind resistance on our faces. You think that's absurd until you feel the desert breeze whip across your bare cheekbones during a training drill and realize maybe there's something to it? But not everyone adapts easily. A few of the older veterans resist. They grumble. They delay. One even pretends he didn't get the order, only to be called out when a dust storm reveals his very unshaven beard fluttering in the wind like a tiny face flag. Alexander's response? Subtle. He doesn't scold. He simply begins surrounding himself with officers and guards who all sport gleaming jaws. His inner circle becomes a sort of model runway of martial cleanliness. You want to be close to power? You shave. You want to be promoted? You shave. It's not punishment, it's peer pressure. Elegant, insidious, effective. And the truth is, Alexander understands optics. He knows that how his army looks is part of how it fights. A clean, uniformed force intimidates. It doesn't look like a bunch of brawlers. It looks like a machine, like an idea. And that idea begins to travel. Even local populations take note. In cities they pass through, people whisper about the beardless Greeks. Rumors bloom like desert flowers. Some say it's a new religious cult. Others believe Alexander is trying to mimic the gods, many of whom are depicted without facial hair in certain temples. The truth? Probably somewhere in between ambition and aesthetics. Meanwhile, back in camp, grooming evolves. Some men start using oil to soften their skin. A few invent primitive exfoliation tools using sand and cloth. Someone gets the bright idea to cool a shaving blade in water before use, and suddenly becomes a camp legend. If TikTok had existed, Desert Glow-Up Routine Conquerors Edition would have gone viral. It might sound ridiculous. It might be ridiculous. But in an army living under sun, steel, and uncertainty, these little rituals give shape to the chaos. And let's not forget the fringe detail whispered around fires late at night. A tiny group of soldiers claims that Alexander is making them more divine by removing facial hair, saying it helps them resemble the idealized, youthful faces of heroes carved into temple friezes. No one says it too loudly, though. The gods have ears, and nobody wants divine side-eye while shaving. Historians, of course, still argue whether any of this was truly Alexander's intent, or just a happy accident of logistics and ego. Some think it was a pragmatic command that gained symbolic weight only later. Others insist it was a calculated psychological move from the very beginning. But while they debate in their libraries, out here in the wilds of Asia, the soldiers have already accepted their new identity. Their beards are gone. Their rituals are in place. And every man now walks into the rising sun with the same smooth, gleaming face and the same quiet understanding. We are no longer individuals. We are the blade. You're crouched in the dirt, heart pounding against your ribs like it's trying to escape, spear tip steady and breath held. Around you, the desert crackles with tension. The enemy is close. You can feel them, even if you can't see them yet. Just beyond the dunes lies the battlefield, a sun-blasted open plain soon to be soaked in sweat, blood, and the strange poetry of history. And your face? Still freshly shaved. You wouldn't have thought it made much difference. A chin is a chin, right? Whether it's hidden under a proud beard or laid bare to the elements. But now, as you wait for that first charge, you begin to understand why Alexander made this such a priority. Because in this kind of fight, up close, chaotic, personal, the tiniest detail can mean the difference between standing tall and collapsing face first into Persian soil. Welcome to beard-grabbing warfare. It sounds ridiculous, almost comedic, like something out of a bad tavern brawl. But hand-to-hand combat in the ancient world was messy, visceral, and unflinchingly brutal. You didn't always have the luxury of range or elegance. Once lines broke and formations crumbled, it turned into grappling, clawing, punching, biting, shoving matches. And in that chaos, a beard wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a handle. Imagine being yanked forward by your own face, your neck torqued sideways, balance thrown, vision blurred. The enemy doesn't need to outmuscle you. He just needs to surprise you. One grab, one twist, one split-second opening, and a dagger's already in your ribs. There are records, some vague, some vivid, of Persian fighters being trained specifically to grab and control opponents by the beard. Whether or not those tales are embroidered by later historians desperate for a spicy detail, the concept tracks. It's a dirty trick, yes, but an effective one. And Alexander? He doesn't believe in letting the enemy have any advantage, especially one as preventable as facial hair. So the shaving order wasn't just about unity or discipline or dessert hygiene. It was a tactical adjustment. Every glinting jawline in his army was a small rebellion against close-quarters vulnerability. You'd think the men might scoff at that, but honestly, many of them have seen it happen. Maybe not always in dramatic fashion, but enough. A friend grabbed, off balance, stabbed. A cousin humiliated in a training brawl. That one unlucky guy who lost half his beard and most of his dignity when an enemy got too close. The desert might dull your senses, but the sting of your comrade falling face first into the sand is hard to forget. It's also worth noting that ancient helmets didn't always offer great protection for the lower face. Unlike later medieval helms that fully enclosed the head, most Greek-style helmets left the jawline exposed. So if your opponent couldn't reach your throat, your beard was the next best target. Alexander didn't invent the concept of practical grooming, of course. Earlier Greek warriors, particularly during the Peloponnesian War, had also considered facial hair in combat. There's some debate among scholars whether this was a new enforcement or just a stricter one. Either way, he didn't leave it up to personal preference. He codified it, enforced it, turned shaving from an optional habit into a battlefield doctrine, and it worked. The Persian Empire, by contrast, celebrated their facial hair. Thick, curled beards were status symbols. Darius himself was often depicted with an immaculately styled beard, oiled, perfumed, braided. In a way, Alexander's clean-shaven army stood in visual opposition to Persian elite aesthetics. It was a kind of reverse propaganda, a symbolic rejection of Eastern excess and a lean toward ruthless, no-frills efficiency. Of course, historians still argue whether it was about safety or symbolism. Was Alexander making a fashion statement or a strategic one? Could it be both? In any case, it left an impression. Persian scouts who observed the Greek lines noted how polished, uniform, and strangely youthful the Macedonian soldiers looked. There was something almost uncanny about them, a disciplined machine of bronzed, gleaming faces, all staring back with calm, unflinching focus. Less like individual men, more like pieces of a god's chessboard. It's here, right before the legendary Battle of Gaugamela, that the practical advantage of a clean-shaven army becomes evident. The battle is a storm. Darius brings more than 100,000 troops, chariots fitted with blades, and even war elephants. He has the numbers, the terrain, and the home field advantage. Alexander? He has precision, planning, and a force of soldiers who look, move, and fight like no one the Persian commanders have ever seen. And when the lines crash into one another, when shields splinter and spears snap and men grapple in the sand, the tiniest edge matters. If your opponent can't grab your beard, can't yank you forward, or twist your neck, or use your face as a leash, well, you just might survive that extra moment. It's not glamorous, it's not poetic, but it's real. You see it happen around you. Friends slipping free from enemy grips, fighters ducking out of headlocks, momentum shifting with each subtle breakaway. Your own blade catches an opponent's side as he stumbles, reaching for a chin that isn't there. And in that moment, you understand, this wasn't about appearance. It was about engineering ungrabbable warriors. And yes, you can smirk at that phrase now, ungrabbable warriors. Sounds like a bad band name. But here in the dust, blood, and blazing sun, it might just be the difference between legend and obituary. Alexander wins the battle, of course. It becomes one of his greatest victories, a turning point that sends Darius fleeing and Persia's grip on its empire unraveling like an old scroll. Historians praise his flanking maneuvers, his use of terrain, his personal courage, all true. But you were there. You remember the scrape of the blade, the sting of that first desert breeze against bare skin. You remember the strange power of 1,000 smooth jaws glinting like polished armor. It's not what wins the war, but it's a detail that shapes the story. And in Alexander's world, details were destiny. The desert wind softens after Gaugamela, as if even the sun has paused to reconsider its wrath. Victory hangs in the air, thick, sweet, and a little exhausting. Darius is gone, the Persian army shattered, and Alexander now walks as more than just a Macedonian king. He is pharaoh in Egypt, Shah in Persia. He's moving fast enough that even the stars above seem to struggle keeping up. But while kingdoms topple and statues are hastily chiseled to resemble his not-so-humble jawline, something quieter unfolds among his men. A slow shift from shaved faces to shaved identities. You see, now that the war against Persia is largely won, Alexander begins pushing into stranger lands. Bactria, Sogdiana, the far edges of what we now call Afghanistan and India. His army moves from deserts into mountains, from cities into jungles, and the line between conqueror and diplomat gets thinner by the day. And that's when the beard thing starts getting complicated. Because here's the truth, not everyone agrees on what power looks like. To the Persians, a grand beard wasn't a battlefield liability, it was a political necessity. Royal portraits show Darius with a stylized beard, coiled and majestic, like the seal of a living god. Persian nobles wore their facial hair with pride. It signified wisdom, age, masculinity, and rank. A beardless face? That was for eunuchs, or boys, or Greeks. Alexander knows this. And yet he continues enforcing his grooming standards, even as he begins adopting Persian dress, customs, and titles. The result? A visual paradox. A man dressed like a Persian king, but with a jawline straight out of a Greek marble bust. And this wasn't just fashion, it was a form of messaging. Alexander wanted to bridge two worlds without fully surrendering to either. He would dress like a Persian to earn local trust, but remain clean-shaven to maintain Macedonian loyalty. A beard might have made him look more like a Persian god-king, but it would have made him less like Alexander. His soldiers noticed. At first, they were amused by the silks, the incense, the bowing rituals. But as Alexander started marrying Persian noblewomen, replacing Greek officers with local administrators, and calling himself King of Asia, their laughter dried up. The beardless grooming code, the same one that once united them, started to feel like a dividing line. They shaved as always, but now they did it with a different look in their eyes. Suspicion, confusion, maybe even fear. Why? Because appearances mattered, more than most would admit. And Alexander, master of optics, was painting a complex portrait, a multicultural empire led by a man who could blend in anywhere but belong nowhere. The beard became a strange kind of symbol in that moment. On one hand, it marked you as a soldier of Alexander's vision, clean, modern, practical. On the other hand, it was now at odds with the lands you were conquering, as if your very face declared, "I'm not from here. I'm just passing through." This led to friction, not always spoken, but deeply felt. A Persian officer might raise an eyebrow at your bare face. A local priest might interpret it as disrespect. A visiting noble might mistake you for a servant. And in return, the Greek soldiers began mocking the bearded locals as backward or weak, even while quietly admiring their jewelry, their horses, their palaces. So now you're stuck in a strange spot. You've conquered an empire. You're thousands of miles from home. And your face, once a symbol of strength, now feels like a signpost screaming foreigner. It's an awkward kind of imperialism, isn't it? But Alexander pushes forward, as always. And here's where things get even more layered. Image wars. While Alexander's troops remain largely clean-shaven, his artists, sculptors, and publicists, yes, he basically had a PR team, start producing statues and coins that portray him as youthful, handsome, and, importantly, beardless. This was a sharp break from previous conventions. Most older rulers from Mesopotamia to Persia were shown with full, flowing beards. Alexander? He wanted to be remembered differently. So he had his face stamped, minted, and carved as the eternally fresh-faced warrior god. And people noticed. The beardless look began to spread. Other Hellenistic rulers started copying the style, eager to capture that same air of invincibility and controlled beauty. Even centuries later, Roman emperors would return to that clean-shaven aesthetic when they wanted to look decisive or divine. Some scholars even argue that Alexander single-handedly changed the face, literally of Western masculinity for generations. Now, not everyone was a fan. Philosophers like the Stoics grumbled that shaving was superficial. Spartans, who loved a good scruffy beard, probably rolled their eyes so hard their helmets shifted. But the trend was undeniable. The world had seen Alexander's face, and it remembered. But let's not forget the quieter side of this transformation. In the daily routines of his soldiers, shaving became more than a military mandate. It became a tether to home, to order, to memory. You'd hear them talk sometimes, over firelight or during the lazy stretch between patrols. One man would say he missed his beard because it reminded him of his father. Another would joke that his children wouldn't recognize him when he returned. A third would stay silent, just rubbing his smooth jaw like it might bring back the smell of fig trees or the sound of the sea. Because as far as the army had marched, as many cities as they'd taken, their faces, shaved clean every morning, still looked like home, like Greece, like the man they followed. And in that, Alexander succeeded again. He turned grooming into loyalty, routine into memory. And his army, even as it grew weary and suspicious, still woke each morning and scraped away their beards like they were sharpening their swords. Historians still debate whether Alexander was fully aware of this psychological nuance or just instinctively brilliant. Was he a master manipulator? Or simply a man who saw the battlefield in everything? But ask the soldiers, and they'll tell you. He made us one. One face, one force, one future. And every sunrise, the razors came out again. Time marches differently in Alexander's empire. One day, you're crossing the Tigris under torchlight. The next, you're scaling some nameless peak in Bactria while your sandals slowly disintegrate. Weeks blur into months, battles into celebrations, and cities into ashes. But one thing never changes: your morning ritual with the blade. At first, it was an order. Now it's just what you do. But lately, as the army moves farther into unknown lands, that familiar scrape across your jaw each day starts to feel less like unity and more like a question. Why do we still shave? Why here? Why now? Because you're no longer in Persian territory. You're in the edge of the world. Snowy passes, dense forests, people who don't speak your language or know your gods. They look at your clean face with polite confusion, like you're trying too hard to impress a dinner guest that left 2 weeks ago. It starts subtly. A few men let the stubble stay a little longer. A day, then 2. Then, one of them shaving entirely. His excuse? I lost my blade. But everyone knows he didn't. It's tucked in his bag, next to the olive oil and that letter from his sister he reads when he thinks no one's looking. And just like that, the beard begins to return. Not all at once, not dramatically, but here and there, patches of rebellion dotting the smooth-faced army like weeds between temple stones. Alexander notices. Of course he does. He always does. But now his response is different. He doesn't issue another decree. He doesn't punish anyone. Instead, he changes the subject, talks about gods, about immortality, about cities he wants to build, and most importantly, about legacy. Because Alexander's vision is no longer about shaving or formations or battlefield efficiency. It's about the future. A new world shaped in his image, diverse, connected, and yes, still weirdly obsessed with cheekbones. Meanwhile, in the tents, the soldiers begin talking. And not just about beards. They talk about the old days, the beard order, the battles it may have saved, the nights it gave them structure, the strange pride it once inspired. And they talk, too, about how it feels to be thousands of miles from home, in places even Homer didn't dream of, and still waking up to a shaving ritual that now feels less like purpose and more like nostalgia. There are arguments. Some insist they must keep shaving. It's what separates them. It's what holds them together. It's what Alexander wanted. Others say it's time to let go. They're not the same men who crossed into Persia. They've changed. Why shouldn't their faces reflect that? One man, an older veteran with a voice like gravel, says, if we're becoming part of this world, maybe it's time we stop trying to look like we still belong in another. No one really knows what to say to that. And here's where the historians lose their minds. Because from this point forward, the records get messy. Some claim Alexander eventually relaxed the grooming code altogether, letting the men grow beards as the campaign dragged toward India. Others say he never backed down, that even after the elephants and monsoons and mutiny, he still wanted his soldiers to face the world clean-shaven and sharp. A few fringe sources even claim that Alexander himself experimented with a beard toward the end of his life, but found it itchy and had it shaved the same day. Total hearsay, of course. But the image of him squirming in his silk robes, trying to scratch his royal chin, is strangely delightful. What we do know is this: discipline was slipping, and not just in grooming. After years on campaign, the men were tired. The enemy kept changing shape, from proud Persian kings to jungle tribes with poisoned arrows. And while their faces still gleamed in morning sun, their eyes had grown distant. Which leads to one of the most telling moments in this whole saga, the mutiny at the Hyphasis River. It's not about beards, strictly speaking, but it's about what beards came to represent: obedience, unity, shared purpose. And at Hyphasis, the men finally say no. They won't go farther. Not for glory. Not for gold. Not even for Alexander. And in that refusal, a kind of invisible beard grows back on every chin. Defiance, old-world masculinity, the right to choose. Alexander is furious, devastated even. But he listens. The army turns back, and in the slow, winding journey westward, some soldiers shave, some don't. The order fades into memory. It becomes a story, a joke, a point of pride. You'll hear it told around fires. Remember when we had to shave in the desert? The time Nicanor sliced half his eyebrow off with a dull dagger? How we looked like an army of marble statues at Gaugamela. They laugh. But always there's a thread of awe in their voices, because in those clean-shaven years, they were more than men. They were pieces of a legend in motion. And Alexander, he was the sculptor. Historians, of course, still argue. Was the beard rule a military stroke of genius, or just a weird control tactic? Was it about safety, uniformity, symbolism? Or was it just another quirk of a leader who believed that every detail, down to the hair on your face, could shape the fate of empires? The truth probably lives in the overlap, because Alexander didn't build an empire by choosing one meaning for things. He layered them. Like his empire, the beard order was both practical and poetic, a tool and a symbol, a command and a statement. And as the army slowly made its way back toward Babylon, toward history, the faces under those dusty helmets told a quiet story. Of war, yes, but also of identity. Of what happens when a man becomes part of something larger, and what happens when he finally starts to take himself back. Babylon. You see it rising on the horizon like a hallucination, golden walls shimmering in the heat, towers stabbing the sky, and scents drifting through the air that your nose hasn't smelled in years. Spices, oils, baked bread. You almost forget the last time your feet touched actual cobblestone instead of dust and rock. For many of Alexander's men, Babylon is a mirage made real. It's not just a city, it's a promise. Of rest, of reward, of finally not waking up with sand in your ears. And for a while, it delivers. The markets burst with color. The courtyards hum with music. Even the baths are large enough to fit 10 soldiers at once. A true miracle. But the mood? It's strange. Because even as the empire reaches its glorious zenith, something inside the army begins to fracture. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet tension of a rope that's been pulled too tight for too long. And part of that tension still lives in your face. Yes, we're still talking about beards, because now in Babylon's melting pot of cultures, the soldiers are no longer just warriors. They're part of an occupying force. And how they look speaks volumes. To the locals, to each other, even to themselves. Some soldiers keep shaving religiously, not out of discipline anymore, but habit. The act is comforting, predictable. It reminds them of who they were when the war still felt righteous, clean, and heroic. Others grow beards, short, long, patchy, defiant. Some are doing it to blend in with locals, others to push back against Alexander's increasingly foreign-looking court. And then there's a third group, the undecideds, the stubbled. The men whose faces mirror their confusion, half loyal, half exhausted, all human. And it's not just the soldiers feeling the shift. Alexander is too. Because here in Babylon, he begins to morph into something different. He spends more time cloaked in silk than armor, more time with astrologers than generals. His nights are filled with rituals, visions, whispers of gods and destiny. He's still clean-shaven. His sculptors and coin makers make sure of that. But now his image floats somewhere above reality. He's no longer just a man. He's a myth in motion. And while his face stays sharp and shining, his empire begins to blur. You can see it at the feasts. Alexander sits between Persian nobles and Macedonian officers, trying to stitch their worlds together with wine and rhetoric. He encourages marriages between his men and local women. He starts calling himself son of Zeus Ammon. He even introduces proskynesis, a Persian court ritual where subjects bow or kneel before the king. To many Greeks, this is too much. They'll shave their beards. They'll follow him through desert, jungle, and mountain. But kneel? No. They start wondering, if Alexander looks like them less and less, is he still one of them? Facial hair in this context becomes a kind of silent protest. Not a loud rebellion, but a visual reminder. We are not Persians, we are Macedonians, and we kneel to no one. And yet, Alexander persists. He hosts games, funds temples, commissions enormous building projects. Every day, he moves farther from the battlefield and deeper into the realm of legacy. And with that shift comes the most ironic twist of all. The beard, once banned for safety, is now allowed again for symbolism. Because in Babylon, appearances aren't just about tactics anymore. They're about politics, identity, theater. Alexander needs to be all things to all people, and for that, uniformity must bend. He doesn't announce the reversal formally. There's no grand speech, no parade of mustaches. But slowly, word spreads. You can grow it back if you want. No one will stop you. And suddenly, the camp looks like a living museum of facial expressions. Some soldiers embrace the freedom. They grow great shaggy beards like mountain prophets. Others trim and style theirs to resemble local elites. And a few keep their faces clean, not because they have to, but because they want to remember what it felt like to belong to something razor sharp and purposeful. And Alexander, he watches. He understands that the beard thing, like so many things, has evolved beyond his control. What once unified now differentiates. What once meant discipline now means choice. And he's tired. Tired in that peculiar way only gods and kings get tired, when they've created a world so big it can no longer fit in their hands. You see it in his eyes. The way he walks past soldiers without inspecting them. The way he lingers at shrines a little too long. The way his once crackling speeches now sound more like dreams whispered into empty halls. Some historians believe this is when Alexander began to unravel. Not physically, but emotionally. His closest friends died or drifted. His men muttered behind his back. His generals jostled for power, each wondering what would happen if the sun they orbited were to suddenly vanish. And maybe, just maybe, that's why he never grew a beard again. Not because he still feared the grab. Not because he clung to outdated discipline, but because the clean-shaven face was the last part of himself he could still control. In a world slipping from his grip, it was one detail he could maintain. His face, sharp as ever, looked out from coins and statues like a symbol of clarity, even as the empire behind it blurred and buckled under its own weight. You, a tired soldier with calloused hands and a few gray hairs in your chin, see that face on a temple wall one morning, and you think, we followed that jawline across the world. Now it watches us silently, while the rest of him drifts into legend. You're still in Babylon when the news begins to trickle out, not with a shout, but a hush, as if even the city itself can't believe it. Alexander is ill. At first, it's easy to dismiss. He's a god, isn't he? Men like him don't get fevers, they don't shiver, they don't sweat through their silks or stare blankly at ceilings. But then the whispers grow louder. He hasn't eaten, he hasn't moved, he hasn't spoken. You wait. One day becomes 2, then 6. The man who once led you across continents now lies unmoving behind heavy curtains, surrounded by healers who argue more than they help. Outside, Babylon holds its breath. No one says it, but everyone knows. If he dies, everything changes. And then, he does. Or so the silence says. There's no final speech, no divine thunderclap, just the quiet shuffling of sandals outside his chamber and the eerie stillness that follows. You don't need an announcement. You feel it the way a ship feels the anchor drop. Alexander the Great, your king, your conqueror, your clean-shaven son, has set. And for a moment, no one knows what to do with their faces. Because now, the beard question becomes something more than grooming. It becomes a question of loyalty, of legacy, of which direction the world will now turn. Some generals immediately let theirs grow, as if to declare, we are our own men again. Others continue to shave, unsure if the old rules still linger, or if shaving is the only way to cling to what once was. And then there's you. You sit outside your tent, blade in hand, staring at your reflection in a bowl of water that smells vaguely like boiled onions. You haven't touched your face in 3 days. Do you keep the ritual or let it go? It's not just about appearance anymore. It's about identity. Because when the man who defined your days is gone, all you're left with is the routine he instilled and what it meant. Across the camp, soldiers begin telling stories of the early campaigns, of jokes made during beard inspections, of that ridiculous moment when someone tried shaving with the edge of a broken shield, of the first time Alexander addressed the army, eyes bright, jaw shining, and spoke of becoming more than men. Historians later will fight over the records. Some will say the beardless army dissolved with Alexander's final breath. Others will claim it lasted for years, that successors clung to the habit like a relic of order in the storm of succession. But you don't need a scholar to tell you the truth. Because you lived it. You were it. The act of shaving wasn't about hair. It was about focus, precision, belonging. It made strangers into brothers, fear into rhythm, and chaos into something you could at least scrape away for a few minutes each morning. In the days following Alexander's death, a strange quiet settles over Babylon. There are no riots, no songs, just men, moving carefully, as if their afraid noise might shatter the fragile world he left behind. And one morning, you wake up and shave again. Not because someone told you to, but because for a brief moment, as the blade skims your skin and the desert air touches your cheek, you remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than conquest. You remember Gaugamela. You remember discipline. You remember him. That clean, determined face, always half a step ahead of destiny. And so you rise, smooth-faced and silent, into a world without Alexander. But not without his mark. Because for all his ambition, his glory, his flaws, he taught you something oddly simple. Sometimes, greatness begins with the smallest cut. And now, the journey slows. The clang of swords fades. The heat of the desert softens to a gentle warmth. The faces that marched beside you, once fierce and proud, are now distant memories, shadows flickering along the walls of sleep. You can still picture that army, still feel the weight of armor, the rustle of linen, the scrape of a blade across your cheek. But they blur now, gently, as if time itself is tucking them in. The razors are gone, the rituals have faded, but the meaning remains. A man once asked his soldiers to shave their beards. It sounded absurd, petty, maybe even vain. But in truth, it was a signal, a way to become something more than a collection of tired, hungry warriors, a way to shed fear, ego, and even identity for the sake of unity. And though the empires rise and fall, though statues crumble and rivers shift, some part of that gesture still lingers. In the smooth curve of a polished coin, in the quiet breath before battle, in the memory of a time when you belonged to something larger. So breathe now. Let your mind settle like dust on a quiet plain. Let the heat of the story fade into the cool hum of the fan beside you. There are no more battles tonight, only rest, only dreams. And perhaps in one of them you'll see a clean-shaven king, smiling faintly as if to say, "You made it." Sweet dreams.